So now for the next couple of things, you might want to turn off the background image, the ground, like so. It helps some of the imperfections to show up a little bit better, especially if we click on this to look at the alpha. We can see, the graininess a little bit easier sometimes than even looking at the regular image. So the point is, with that off, we can now continue with our little experiments here. And I would also mention there's two ways of dealing with quality. One is we want to make the image look as nice as possible when we render it while having it not take too much time. But also, kind of like when we just did the 1 pixel sample thing here, when we're iterating on this, like before we render it, but when I'm just like changing stuff around here in Houdini, I want it to happen quickly. So we're not just trying to figure out how to make it look better. We want to figure out how to make it look worse in a way that it renders quickly, but it's good enough for us to make decisions based off of. So we can have one set of settings for when we're playing around and a different set of settings for when we are ready to do our final render. That's called takes, and we'll talk about that in the next chapter or two. But just so you know where we're heading with it, there is a reason for discovering and making it look worse. That's also beneficial for working in here. So one way you can make it look worse is you could bring the max ray samples down. When we send a ray out through a pixel of our image and then into the scene, and it hits the volume, it samples the volume and says, how dense are you? And how much light do you receive? The way we figure out how much light it receives is by sending out indirect samples. We basically say, okay, the ray has reached a point in the volume. Now send rays from that point to the lights. How much light are you receiving? Is it being blocked by geometry? Is it being blocked by dense smoke? So we have to start a whole nother ray tracing path from the volume over to the light. We want to send those rays in lots of different directions. And that's not just necessarily a straight line, because the light itself might have a wide area, and some of those rays might reach it, and some of them might be blocked. So we'll talk more about this example later, but this is a light, and this is an obstacle, and this is our volume. So a primary ray, like the ones we saw with the ray tracing example a minute ago, that would be this, and as the ray comes out, and it hits a volume here, it's shooting up secondary rays at the various lights in the scene. If all of the rays hit the light, it'll be bright. If some of the rays hit the light and some of them don't, it averages to kind of a darker color. And then, if all of the rays are being blocked, then there's no light. The average of all these dark things here is nothing. So then we get back into the light again, and so forth. So that is to say, these are secondary rays. So all that is to say, it will try to dynamically figure out how many rays are appropriate, depending on the kind of light that it is and what other assumptions it can make. But all that is to say that, and I'm going to take a snapshot here, when we lower this, it will again look worse. And be much faster though. Maybe it doesn't look that much worse. Check that out. This render took 12 seconds. This render took 4 seconds. Can you see any difference at all? Well, you can actually. It's a little bit in the shadowed areas, it's a little worse. See that? If we were to pump up the light quite a bit, we can see it easier, how much worse it is. So why did that make the shadows worse? Because any, surface volume, we send a ray to it and it finds a light. Well, it didn't really, one ray was fine for finding the light. But for these areas where we sent a ray out from the camera to the volume, and then it's sending rays in lots of directions, some of them are being obscured by this dense smoke. Some of them are not. And so we get graininess. So anything that we, reduce here is going to make it look worse. But hey, now I can just iterate faster. Like if I scrub my thing here, well, I guess it still has to load in our 1 gigabyte file, but the point is that we can make changes faster. I could, let's say, maybe a better example would be I could go over to my light and say, I want to see what it looks like if it was twice as bright. And it renders real fast. And I can see what it looks like. I want to see what it looks like if it's 4 times as bright. And I can see what that looks like real fast. That's why this is important. I might need to go to the Pyro shader and be like, I want to see what it looks like if it was even denser. The point is that we get to play with it faster by having these quality settings down. So maybe 1 sample is fine there. Noise level. Noise level is actually pretty straightforward. How much noise is acceptable? When we talk about how many rays should it send 1? Should it send 9? It's based off of this noise level here. Noise level says how much noise is acceptable. So the higher I set this, the more noise is acceptable in the image. And it will err on automatically choosing 1 ray sample. See how we're back to 4 seconds again, but this still says 9. As opposed to saying, or that was the same, I guess. The default, 0.01, means not much noise is acceptable, a very low amount of noise. So you can see it's spending more time now. It's being forced to send out lots of rays in order for it to not be a noisy image. You know, the lower you make this, it will cap out eventually, because if it was already choosing 9 ray samples, then this isn't really going to change much of anything. Although it does look like it's making it take longer. So this is one of the most commonly changed ones when you're just trying to iterate and get results out faster and just to see what it looks like. Just lower this. It is noisier, but it rendered way faster. Global quality is fine. I don't really use this that much. Basically, as you can see, it's kind of a global way of saying all of these things. Diffuse quality, we don't have diffuse in this, meaning like standard geometry. We don't have subsurface scattering. We don't have reflections. We don't have refractions. We do have volumes. So there's really no difference. But if you had a complicated scene of lots of things, you could change this here. So what are the quality settings? Quality has to do with how well the geometry is represented in the renderer. Meaning, this is a certain amount of voxels. It has a quality to it, it has a density of voxels. By changing volume quality, it basically says like, hey, more or less treat this like don't have the rays stop and sample every voxel. You can kind of skip ahead. Ray marching in rendering is kind of really tying together the stuff we've learned so far. We've got the primary ray comes through the pixel on the image, and then it comes here, as we saw. And if this was a solid object, we could just do our lighting calculation and then be done with it. But this being a volume, we need to go deeper into it. And all these different lighting calculations then combine to be, again, more work for the renderer. Now, how large these jumps are determines how much work there is. If it can do big jumps from here to here to here, then it'll render faster. If we want to do lots of little ones, it'll be more accurate, but of course it'll be slower. For every one of these lighting calculations, we also determine, well, how dense is it? If it's super dense, like a really foggy day, and we can't see very much farther, it'll stop. It won't actually keep going the way we have here in the demo. But if it's a thin volume, it can keep going. It hasn't reached maximum opacity yet. So that ultimately is how the pixel values are being calculated. It's trying to see, well, how much light am I able to see before I run out of opacity. Once I reach a wall, then there you go. That's the final color. As long as it's still kind of thin and it can keep going, it'll keep trying. But yeah, all that is to say, the work that the renderer is doing is the primary ray, then really these sub-pixel rays, the lighting calculation, and all of that's being done even per ray march step. I'll let that run for a second so you can see. It doesn't matter that it's not checking these lighting values because all we care about is the final pixel things here. So that's the only lighting calculations it needs to do. I mean, that's really what volume step rate is, but it kind of goes hand in hand with volume quality. So like all these things, it will make it be grainier the lower it is. So we went from this to this, which again, you can see grainy is in there. I don't use this one as much. It can also change the look sometimes. The volume step rate will definitely change the look. The higher you make this, the less stops it will make as it travels through your volume. Or am I doing the opposite way? Yeah, there you go. So this is letting us, this is basically saying 1 divided by this number is how many voxels you can skip. So the default is 0.25. So every 4 voxels or so, it'll make a sample. So if we go above 1, it's going to make multiple samples within a voxel, which is almost never useful, but could theoretically be useful if you had maybe very large voxels. But if you had large voxels, then what are you doing trying to make a nice render, honestly, through this way? It could be useful to capture very nuanced lighting, but again, this is just going to slow it down. There's no limit to how much this can slow it down. The higher we make this, look how long it's taking now. It's not even anywhere near done yet. So I don't use this that much, but it is a good way to really screw up your render. So though if we make this super small, look, it finished rendering immediately. It's like a real-time renderer practically at this point. But this is, the rays are barely getting time to stop. This is basically saying, hey, every 50 voxels take a sample. So that's why it barely even sees it. It actually looks less dense now because it's missing so much. So I tend to not use that much, or volume quality for that matter. But it will significantly speed things up. But I find the noise level one is pretty good, again, at a good trade-off. Now, going back the other way, the last setting that I like to talk about a lot, my favorite setting, is stochastic samples. Stochastic samples is wonderful. Here we are with a kind of standard render now. Basic pixel samples, basic noise level, but we still have graininess. We still have some graininess. So what do we do? How do we fix that? Like, it's really clear over here. Again, if we make this brighter, you can really see it. How do we fix this? Stochastic samples. Stochastic samples directly addresses this issue. Stochastic samples is a quality setting that simply says in low transparency area or high transparency areas, give it more samples. Give it more transparency samples. That's exactly what we want. So let's just target that. So watch what happens if we go to 8. We went from this to this without really it taking that much longer. In fact, let me give you a baseline. Let's let this one finish. So this one's going to take, because I'm back to my normal noise settings and everything else. So that took 21 seconds. And if I go back to the default of this, which is 4, it will be faster, but it won't be that much faster. It's not going to be twice as slow. Like, we doubled the stochastic samples, but the render didn't get twice as slow. It is slower, but it's not twice as slow. And it won't affect any other need to raise pixel samples and things. I'm actually kind of surprised that it's even that slow right now. If you went down to 1 stochastic sample, as usual, it will be, you know, faster, but it will be way worse. So stochastic samples, to me, I like to go up to 8 on this. It makes things look quite nice without needing to resort to this. So, again, sure, it does slow the renderer down, but we need it to not be grainy. especially later when we want to push this stuff around in compositing. We need things to be nice and smooth, as you'll see why later. But in any case, going up to 21 is way better than doubling the pixel samples, which would make it take 4 times as long. So this took less than twice as long, which is way better than it taking 4 times as long. So stochastic samples are great. Cool. Oh, well, I'll just keep it at 8. No, I'll keep it 4. Now we're going to talk about takes and stuff, though, and how we're actually going to organize these settings.